Good morning and welcome everyone. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor at Australia Institute Press, and it's my great delight to welcome you to Australia's biggest book club today with Ariel Bogle. I'm coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. It's a pretty grey, chilly day, but the wattle is coming out. So this land is getting ready for a burst of spring in no time, I'm sure. Just some reminders for Zoom. You can type questions in the Q&A box at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. A reminder to keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website afterwards, australiainstitute.org.au. So we're here to talk about Conspiracy Nation, which is a really extraordinary book. I've been very much looking forward to having this conversation today with Ariel Bogle, who is a reporter with a focus on technology, law, and the internet. An investigations reporter at Guardian Australia, she's won a Walkley Award for her journalism and worked in media in Australia and the United States for more than a decade. Previously, she was a technology reporter with the ABC, and her reporting has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Australian Financial Review, Slate, and others. Welcome, Ariel.
Hi, good to be here.
And we have one of the two authors of this book. Cam Wilson is your co-author. He sadly couldn't be here today, but I'm sure that you will be able to take us through all of the most important and really fascinating details from this book. So, as I mentioned, it's co-authored. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like to co-author a book like this, a bit of the process of how it came to be and how it differs a bit from some of the journalism that you've done?
Yeah, sure. Well, just to give a bit of the origins of this book, so both Cam and I have been reporting on the internet culture technology beat for quite a while now, and we've worked together at some places but just been sort of colleagues and friends, I guess. And both during the pandemic, both of us had been reporting on that the environment that was growing around that pandemic, whether it be some of the false claims about the virus when it was first emerging, looking at the anti-lockdown movement, looking at some of the anti-vaccine messaging that was spreading at that time. And I think we met up, it was like early 2023, we were just catching up and we were just talking about that time. And I think one thing that really struck us was how much the narrative was that everything was just imported from America when it comes to conspiracy theories, that Australia is just sort of like a net receiver of these ideas and we just take them and then sort of fold them into our own culture. But we didn't think that was quite right. Like when we were talking to people, when we were sort of going down internet rabbit holes, we could see that there's some innate Australianness, there's our own history in this space. And I guess the question we wanted to ask too was, what does this all say about us? Because I guess like broadly conspiracy theories emerge in all cultures, in all places over history. They're nothing particularly shocking. I mean, the fact of their existence isn't shocking, but they usually arise from a point in time, like they do say something about the culture from which they arise. And I guess we wanted to see what that meant in Australia. As for the writing of our book together, it's a good question. I think we were both like at least on the front foot with that because we're both journalists in newsrooms. You're used to collaborating, you're used to taking feedback and being edited. But just like from practical point of view, I think it really helped that we planned the book pretty thoroughly in advance, including like the kind of events and people we definitely wanted to include, and then sort of split it by chapter, more or less. And we'd sort of schedule it out, go and report and write the chapter, then like give it to the other person who would edit it and edit it. And so hopefully we brought it all together cohesively because we didn't want to be like a cam chapter, error chapter, like when you're reading it. Hopefully that comes across.
Yeah, I was really impressed reading it actually, just how fluid it is in the transitions. I hadn't understood that it was, maybe drafting one chapter by one person and one by the other person. It's a brilliant read, and even though it's at times very dark series of topics, it definitely doesn't drag the reader down. So I thought it would be good to start with a bit of a definition of what do you mean when or what do people in common parlance mean when they talk about conspiracy theories, and then what did you come to understand over the course of writing and researching the book?
Yeah. So I'm just like going back to the first chapter again. I've got it here with some post-its. I guess broadly, like our definition of conspiracy theories is one that most agree on. Like at its heart, it's the idea that there is a plot being enacted in secret, usually by like a shadowy group, a cabal, a group of outsiders against the common good, against the in-group. So this could take all manner of different forms, but that's the sort of narrative at its heart. Um, I guess broadly, conspiracy theories are stories in that vein that are unproven, or that yet don't yet have hard evidence to make them true, at least in the public's mind. I guess that it's a fluid area, and we do take care to say in the book, like, of course, there are real conspiracies. As journalists, we aim to uncover them, uncover what power is doing in secret. But conspiracy theories, by definition, aren't accepted as common truth. And often they sort of defy evidence because for a lot of people dedicated to some of the most extreme of these ideas, like a lot of any evidence you can offer to the contrary can be explained or folded into the conspiracy itself. They become sort of unprovable, but also unfalsifiable.
Mm. And one of the topics that you explore over the course of the book is the relationship between the media and the people involved. There's some really incredible writing about people who were around and related to the incident at Wiambilla. Uh, can you tell us, how about we start with the story of Danielle, not her real name. So she's someone whose partner got wrapped up in what I would call conspiracy theories around the time of COVID. What was Danielle's experience like?
So I think Danielle's experience is really representative of a lot of stories I was hearing, Cam was hearing during the pandemic, where the disconnect from normal life because of lockdowns, because of the anxiety and unknown of the pandemic, sent some people who might have already had some predisposition into these paths. So, in this case, Danielle, her partner Emily, had some sort of prior health issues, I guess, some characteristics that might have made her predisposed to be open to some of these ideas. But during the pandemic, it got much worse. She started getting quite connected to QAnon. I'm sure most people on this call are familiar with this, but broadly, the idea was that Donald Trump was at war with a cabal of elite Democratic politicians, celebrities, and others who were engaged in the ritual abuse of children, and that he would confront this sort of deep state entity in an event called the Storm. And there's all kinds of extras to that narrative, but it did suck a lot of people in, I think, because it really centered around the idea of abuse of children, which is such an emotive sort of idea. We can probably talk a bit more about that, but Emily got very folded into these ideas, really addicted to watching some of these key sort of QAnon or conspiracy influencers on social media, to the point that even if they were like traveling, she would like be looking for reception so that she could, see what was going on. And eventually, in this case, it did break down their relationship because Emily just started sharing thoughts and ideas that Danielle just couldn't really countenance any longer, including sort of homophobic ideas that are often tied to some of these communities. So I thought she was very representative, because other people I talked to during the pandemic, who, when I was working at the ABC at the time, there were people who were making decisions about whether they could still see their mother-in-law because she thought that the COVID vaccine was like a microchip for mind control, but it just meant that you had to make this tough decision about whether you could let someone who was unvaccinated around your children, or like somebody who was immune compromised, the really sort of tough family decisions.
Mm.
So that was Danielle's and Emily's story.
Yeah. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between QAnon in the States and pseudo law in Australia. Um, it seems as though there have been some lessons that people locally have taken from things that have happened in the States, and not just QAnon, but other kinds of conspiracy movements or descriptions as well. What kind of relationship did you see between the States and Australia?
Hmm. With QAnon, like, of course, the internet and social media let those ideas flow back and forth. So I can remember, like, just to give a bit of history, predating QAnon is this idea of Pizzagate. There was this when the let me get this right. When the Hillary Clinton's campaign emails were hacked, there were all these emails leaked. Some of them mentioned a pizza restaurant in DC, and that kind of got folded into this conspiracy theory that Comet Pizza, I think was the name of it in DC, was the center of a child abuse ring. It actually ended up that like an individual from North Carolina went there with weapons to like free the children, and luckily no one was hurt, but he was arrested, so people took this idea seriously, and they thought it was coming through in the kind of code of the emails from the Clinton campaign. And this is sort of a precursor fed into QAnon. And we saw QAnon grow in Australia too, especially around this concept of saving the children became like a key slogan. And some of the other writers around this topic argue that that's what also led it sort of slipped the boundaries from the fringes, the most extreme conspiratorial communities, into more wellness spaces, more women-centered spaces, just because this idea of saving the children, like how can you say no to that? So we saw that in Australia too. And I think what was really appealing for some people, maybe during lockdowns as well, was that it is kind of like a giant puzzle. If you are like taking, say, the Clinton campaign's emails and deciphering language, it's sort of like a puzzle. It sort of lets you be at the center of a giant ecosystem and community that is dedicated to unpacking secrets. And like I can see how I can understand like broadly the appeal of that. But of course, like QAnon completely has nothing to do with how child abuse typically happens in countries like Australia, where most often is somebody known to the child, often a family member. And so we did talk in the book to people too about the effect that that could have. If our key sort of narratives around child abuse are ones that are so far-fetched and far from, the most common reality, the damage that could have for people that have genuinely experienced child abuse. And there were people that have had those experiences that got sort of sucked into QAnon as well. So there's a lot of damage to unpick there.
And you talk a bit about the slogan "Expose the 28" and what that was like in Australia. You would see people at protests carrying signs or wearing T-shirts saying "Expose the 28." Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. So having been to a lot of different types of protests, anti-lockdown protests, rallies against the Indigenous voice to Parliament, rallies against the rollout of renewable energy, these things, may not on the surface have a lot in common, and there are people there with genuinely held beliefs about each of those topics. So I'm not saying it's a completely conspiratorial scene, but interestingly, at every single one of those events I went to, there were always some sign or t-shirt or reference to this idea of expose the 28. So to give some background there, Senator Bill Heffernan stood up in Senate estimates back in like 2015, I think. And this was just at the beginning of the Royal Commission into the institutional abuse of children, of course. So this topic was very front of mind for people. But he said that he had a list of 28 high-profile pedophiles in Australia, including a former prime minister. He said it was a police document. And in estimates, you can see the hand side, like it just goes back and forth a bit. The Attorney General of the time is sort of like, and what should we do about this? Or like, what have you done with this document? And he's like, I've given it to the Royal Commission, and it's sort of left there, at least in the official record. But because this list, people have clung on to this list, I guess, as the sort of central sin of Australian government, the cover-up, quote unquote, of prominent pedophiles, even though this list, according to people that claim to have seen it, is like just completely unsigned. Most of the people on it are dead. There's very little you could like actually say about it at this point because it has never been officially investigated. It's sort of become just like a code word, I guess, for a lot of Australian conspiracy theory culture. And you can see it in almost every protest you go where some of these elements are. So it's just an interesting one to follow that thread. And even One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts, I spoke to him because he took a look at this list because he was getting so many calls from his constituents about it, and he's willing to ask the questions, he said, about this type of thing, but he found there was nothing to it himself. So and he put out a video about it. But of course, that hasn't stopped a lot of people. But I think the expose the 28 sort of thread in Australian conspiracy culture sort of primed the ground in some ways for QAnon to find its entrance here too. So these ideas of ritual abuse of elite groups abusing children that is so integral to QAnon already had it pre-existed in Australia, and that's probably why there was a decent reception here. And of course, like conspiracy theories always cling to embers of truth in some ways because we were confronting the cover-up of child abuse in Australian churches, in children's homes, in schools. So, you know, these things, there's always like this thread, I guess, and that is what forms the kind of emotional appeal, I think.
Mm. And something that you explore, you know, you mentioned the word elites, this idea of elites perpetrating crimes and not being prosecuted, and that sort of power dynamic between everyday Australians and then people who are controlling their lives. That question of the power dynamic seems to be at the heart of a lot of what you're talking about, especially in relation to pseudo law. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the relationship between power and pseudo law and how these things intersect.
Yeah, I was looking for the quote because Joseph Oshinsky, who's a academic who looks at these topics, he's got some interesting writing about that. And in his sort of estimation, conspiracy theories are about identifying power or understanding power. He's got this quote that are like, conspiracy theories are for losers, not meant pejorative, like not meant like losers in the casual sense, but like the losers of a power spectrum. That's who they're for because they identify somebody who feels that something is happening to them that they don't understand and can't control, which I think is quite apt. So with pseudo law, like the term people probably are more familiar with is sovereign citizen, and I think it really did come to people's attention during the pandemic. Some media outlets started publishing these kind of sort of strange confrontation videos where often police would stop somebody who was speeding or at a lockdown checkpoint, and they would be like, yeah, they would sort of throw this legal verbiage at the cop. They would be like, I'm traveling, not driving, you have no jurisdiction, or I don't consent, like this kind of language. Um, so broadly, we use the term pseudo law because the sovereign citizen is quite a specific sort of American genre of this, but pseudo law sort of encapsulates the whole of legal language that is quasi-legal language that's legalish but is not real law. Then there's a lot of distinct sort of ways people make this argument. I mean, I think people's eyes sort of blur when you start trying to actually explain it because it's so bizarre and some obviously. But just to take one example, one strain of pseudo law argues that the government, whether it be the US government, the Australian government, has been overtaken by a corporation kind of without our knowledge, and that our names written in all capital letters on a driver's license, a birth certificate, is actually is the way that they control us. We've sort of entered unknowingly into a contract with that corporation through these kinds of documents. And that's how they control us, or that's how they keep money from us, etc. So sometimes people go into courts trying to sever that contract, essentially.
Mm.
But I guess, at heart, pseudo law is where people are denying the legitimacy of law, arguing that the government has been corrupted in some way. But there are a lot of different strains out there. But it has a long history in Australia. Like in the 80s and 90s, there was one particular guy who went all the way to the High Court trying to get the Australian currency declared illegal tender because it wasn't like gold and silver. He was eventually declared like a vexatious litigant. Australia has a really long history of micronations, of course, like Hutt River, where people just take a patch of land and declare it sovereign and separate from the rest of the country. And Harry Hobbs, who's a legal academic at UNSW, has written a book about this. And it's interesting, he pointed out to me, like with micronations at least, the Australian government has kind of regarded it with bemusement, not with aggression. Like Hutt River guy, like he did get in trouble from a tax for tax reasons, but like no one tried to like overturn his jurisdiction per se. So there is an argument, I suppose, that we haven't taken pseudo law seriously enough in Australia because speaking to people at the coalface, council workers, people in the court, lower courts, police, of course, they're dealing with this a lot, especially in regional areas. And it's a really tough thing to deal with because it just sort of gums up the workings of the court. It slows everything down. Um, but it also, it can escalate because often if people are dedicated to these ideas, they have this idea that they're fighting tyranny, trying to get back to a time when the law was just and right, and the government or the face of the government, whether it be council workers and magistrates, etc., are the face of tyranny, and so people can take that to the extreme.
Mm. Speaking of magistrates, you talk about David Halpern, who was a magistrate and is now Dean of Law at Southern Cross University. And you relate a story that he told you about a time when he felt that he successfully engaged with someone who was trying some of these arguments in court.
Yeah.
Um,
And I spoke also to the person that on the other side of that. So I spoke to a man called Robert Sudi, who he in around 2012 had some driving offences and went online to kind of figure out a way to deal with them. He didn't think they were fair, right? And he stumbled into some of these pseudo law ideas. When he took them to the court in front of Magistrate Halpern, he tried to use them. And David Halpern told me that that day, I guess he'd had some other cases fall over, so he had time to kind of engage. And Robert was receptive to that, and went away and like did more research essentially, and came to the conclusion that the ideas he'd tried to use weren't correct. And now he runs a website called the Freeman Delusion, which is a really valuable record of pseudo law arguments in Australia, court records and others. So it was interesting, like for when somebody has the time to meaningfully engage with somebody, it can help. But of course, our courts don't really, that's very, very rare. And
mm,
I want to point out too, and we point out in the pseudo law chapter, like if you some people stumble into these ideas in a kind of naive way out of confusion or a need. Of course, I'm sort of separating that from people that take it to the extreme. But if we are generous, at least to the people that stumble into this kind of by accident, trying to look for legal help, we probably do need to recognize that our legal system is incredibly complicated. And so again, this power dynamic comes to why people might turn to these ideas. Because if you look at some of these institutional structures, the legal system, the government, the medical system, banking system, like if you're an individual staring that kind of institution in the face, like it can look like conspiracy because it is so bizarre. Like the law, even lawyers will admit that they only know the patch of law that they've studied. They don't know anything. The rest could be mumbo jumbo, like it is really hard to understand this kind of language of these sort of carved off elite institutions. So you can, if you're generous, you can understand why some of these ideas might hold some appeal.
mm. And I think that's really one of the strengths of the book is that you're not just interested in relating sensationalist stories. This week in the media, there's been a lot of discussion of sovereign citizens after the tragedy in Victoria. And I think this book is going to be really useful for people who are trying to grapple with, how we've ended up in this situation. I wanted to turn now to the Christchurch shooter. And so this was the horrific incident where an Australian went into a mosque and committed a massacre in Christchurch. And I mean, I even said it just then, the Christchurch shooter. And so the concern is that Australia hasn't really reckoned with this, hasn't quite taken responsibility for it, because there hasn't been an incident like that on Australian soil since Port Arthur, in part because of the firearm regulations that we have here. Can you talk a little bit about this story and what kinds of conversations you were having around it?
Yeah, sure. So we wanted to tackle the terrorist attack in Christchurch because it was committed by Australian, and we wanted to kind of ground that story back in Australia from where it emerged from. So for context, the terrorist had a manifesto, and we don't want to take it verbatim, because it was a document sort of calculated to go viral. It had all these kind of memes and 4chan references and yada yada in it. But the title was The Great Replacement, and in the document, it does discuss an obsession with the idea of Muslim people replacing the white people in Europe and sort of Western civilization. And this conjures this concept of the Great Replacement, which I guess broadly is the conspiracy theory that there is a plot out there to eliminate white people from the West via immigration, via birth rates, etc. And there's a long history here. There's sort of comes out of a French book. There's also another book called The Camp of Saints, which is another French book, which a lot of white supremacists refer to, that kind of uh, has this scenario where millions of sort of Indian migrants flood Europe and take over and yada yada. So there's like a long history here essentially. And today, like a lot of people on the far right try to sort of argue that the Great Replacement is happening through immigration, divorced from a plot. But it does have this origin, this sort of pretty conspiratorial origins, and it still maintains that in a lot of circles. So we wanted to trace a bit of that history here because in Australia, of course, like in the 2010s, after 9/11, there was plenty of language in Australian media, in government that used some of this language. There was a lot of discussions of immigration become invasion, really strong language. And we also, wanted to trace back to remind people how embedded the Christchurch terrorist was in Australia's far right scene. He was on far right Facebook groups in Australia during the Reclaim Australia era, which was sort of 2015, 16-ish, which was a series of like street protests and others, again, against Muslim immigration. And we talked to members of the Muslim community about how they feel. And it seems like for some of those we spoke to, there is this feeling that Australia has ignored his Australianness. There's very little, when the anniversary of Christchurch comes around, there's not much recognition of it. In Parliament, they don't say that much. They don't recognize the dozens of people who died in that attack, the pain they're still going through. I mean, the cases in New Zealand are still ongoing because there's actually a coronial inquest into the incident right now. So the story is not done in any way, but Australia hasn't really participated in the telling of it. At least we've had no public investigation of whether Australian authorities knew much about him or whether there could have been any intervention into him and his life. I mean, he did travel overseas a lot, but he, as I said, had pretty strong ties to Australia's far right scene itself. So that's what we wanted to look at in the book as well, just the Australian roots of Great Replacement theory and the Australian roots of the Christchurch terrorists.
Mm. We've got a bunch of questions, so I think we'll turn to those now. The first one's from Mark Rode, and he asks, I'm just going to abbreviate a little bit because it's quite long. What relationship do these conspiracy theories have to mental illness, such as paranoia, bipolar personality disorders? Had some family experience with that, with a family member. And he asks, are there any strategies in mental health to help people deal with this in the same way they might perhaps deal with other negative or unhealthy thought patterns?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, like we acknowledge in the book and that we're not psychologists. We didn't want to get too far down the sort of diagnosis road, but we do, of course, acknowledge that mental health can play a definite role here. In the book, I talked to a psychologist who had about his experience with some of his clients during the pandemic. So he had some clients that started sharing conspiratorial ideas with him, QAnon, a lot of anti-vaccine stuff. For him, it seemed like a lot of people were sort of really hyper focused on the vaccine as a kind of threat to their bodily autonomy, to their health, etc. And talked to another psychologist, a researcher, Matt Marks, as well about it. And unfortunately, like I can't speak to the treatment of mental illness, of course, it's not my expertise at all. But with some of, at least from David's perspective, the psychologist, it was about people's things change when people's material needs were met. So, for example, he had a client who I think was a veteran, had some sort of workplace injury, but was having a lot of trouble getting the financial and health support that he needed to deal with that. And that was around the time that he was espousing these ideas. But when he was able to get the help he needed, his reliance, he sort of stopped talking about it as much, and sort of his need for those ideas diminished. And that's what Matt Marks told us too. Like in his experience, it seems like when people turn to these ideas often out of a need to put a sort of a simple story around a complex situation, to find someone to blame for what's happening to them, or to like place understanding about like a real frustration or really difficult to understand situation. So when that situation can resolve, people's need for these ideas can diminish and they can turn away. And I guess for people who have relationships with someone who's really relying on conspiratorial beliefs, it's really hard. Like, of course, if they're putting you in danger, if they're using these ideas in a sort of hateful way to be racist or hateful in some other way, that's one thing. But if you can maintain the relationship and keep that thread, things can change. It's not completely hopeless, but every situation is entirely unique, and some people don't necessarily give them up, even if they sort of give up talking to you, if they know you hate talking about it.
This isn't quite a question, but let's see if I can turn it into a question. Heather De Cruz says it seems that the language of many contemporary conspiracy theories is no longer a fringe issue, and asking about the use of language by people in the Liberal Party and the National Party. What do you have to say about mainstream use of language that in the past might have been called conspiratorial?
Yeah, well, in the book, we wanted to talk about that and call out how dangerous it is, I guess. So one era, I suppose, that we look at in the book is the discussion around safe schools. So this was an anti-bullying program for LGBTQ plus youth in like the mid 2010s. It started in Victoria, but was getting rolled out nationally when it became a sort of topic of national debate. A lot of people had perspectives on this, and there were a lot of false claims about what it would teach kids as well that made it kind of a very febrile atmosphere. And some of the language around that time used by politicians and mainstream papers was borrowed from conspiracy theory. So, the idea that there was a plot against Australian youth, that like communists were plotting to teach Australian youth all to be gay or all to be trans. This was the kind of language we were seeing, like really heated language in reference to conspiracy, that this was a Trojan horse against Australian children, et cetera, et cetera. So we look at that in the book and want to, I guess, make the argument this isn't just for the fringes. A lot of time politics, people with power like these frameworks because it frames them, it's an us and them narrative. Like if you are a politician using this language, you can kind of put yourself in the veil of the victim when you are actually somebody with power, because you're fighting back against a nefarious plot who have ill will towards the population, whether it be kids or Australia in general, etc. So it is like highly emotive language and a highly emotive framework that we all recognize. And so that's why it slips so easily out of the mouth, I think, for some politicians and some parts of the media.
There's a question whether these kinds of groups are funded by millionaires. I might change that to billionaires because I don't know how far $1 million gets you these days. Or like the anti-Hillary campaign was potentially funded by the Russians.
Yeah, it's a very complex space. It does seem like, at least with the Hillary Clinton's emails, it was hacked by Russia, I think is pretty widely acknowledged right now. And it's a tough one. Like, I definitely think there is evidence of nation states involving themselves in the spread of these ideas for their own purposes, whether it is just to sow confusion. I've tracked corporate use of some of these ideas as well, like whether it is around climate change or even like the palm oil industry. Like there is inorganic, I guess, spread of these ideas, but I don't want to sometimes I think that we can just be like, oh, it's the Russians, and that discounts like the sort of organic interest in these ideas, or doesn't recognize how much people do participate in these communities of their own volition. So it's a complex mix. Like I'm sure there's a lot going on that's yet to be uncovered, but it's not all Russia, I guess is what I want to say.
Yeah. Ben Gilmore asks, why is the right wing in particular immune to evidence to the extent that science and facts are seen as left wing by some people? Some members of parliament or the Sky After Dark persuasion deny climate science.
Mhm.
And that ties into the next one. Can you talk about conspiracy theories and climate change from Robert McLean?
Mm. Yes, of course, there's a lot of conspiratorial language around climate change. I guess we, as I was referencing earlier, going to some of these anti-renewable rallies and things, there was, genuine community concern about like some of these wind farm or solar projects, but there was a mix there too of conspiratorial language and imagery, etc. There was like a reckless renewables rally in Canberra, I think, is one of the ones I'm thinking of. Um, yeah, I mean, other people are probably more qualified to speak on this too, the sort of crisis of expertise, the way that the notion of expertise has been politicized as something left or right, is I don't pretend to have any solutions to that, but it is a very dangerous time we're living in when it comes to that, especially around, of course, science, around climate change, and around health, public health.
Mm. I just wanted to throw in a question here about what research looks like. Often, something people might
Mhm.
say is people who believe in ideas that others might call fringe. They'd say, "Oh, you need to do your research. I've done my research. You do your research." Uh, can you talk a bit about the kinds of access to information and what kinds of information people are privileging when they're coming to make up their mind?
It's an interesting question. It just reminds me too, during the pandemic, when there were various claims about the virus, how it spread. I'm trying to think of one example. It's again like when I was referencing pseudo law, when people come up against these very complex institutions like our court system, science and the production of science itself is, if you're an outsider, also is like a different language, is completely complex and sometimes impenetrable. And so it was interesting seeing some of these claims around the vaccine, for example, COVID-19 vaccine. People were doing the research, diving into research journals, but what they were pulling out was preprints, which, hadn't yet been peer reviewed, or they would be like, oh, look, this study from Italy, and the study had 6 people in it. There was this some people's ability to decipher or determine good research from bad, or where research was at in its life cycle was hampered by a lack of knowledge, which is
Mm,
understandable, but it became dangerous in the way it was deployed to undermine public health. Um, so that continues in all manner of things, because you can find evidence for any belief you want. And what we talk about in the book as well is this idea of motivated reasoning. If we're all honest with ourselves, we probably all decide how we feel and then work backwards to justify the belief. So um, we don't really act like scientists generally in our belief systems. We act more like lawyers, trying to argue a point and gather the evidence to prove the point, rather than working from the evidence up to the decision about what to believe. That's for all of us, not just conspiracy theorists. If we're honest about it, not all our beliefs have been arrived at through empirical research. So that's something else I think we need to recognize as well, about how people might turn to these ideas.
mm. Graham Cheverton asks whether the sovereign citizen movement descended from pseudo law, and then is the decline of citizenship education and social studies associated with an increase in conspiracy theories?
Hmm. It's a great question. I mean, there's no like empiric, line on a graph that can show the causation that I'm aware of. Um, but when we are, doing some of the reporting for it, I came across a submission from the constitutional scholar Anne Twomey, and she was saying how many letters she gets from pseudo law, people arguing that she misunderstands some constitutional point, etc. And she was arguing for greater civics education in Australia. And I think there probably is some value to that. Like a lot of, if we want people to participate in our way of government, we need people to understand it better than they do, certainly. And then with some of this pseudo law stuff, if somebody's just arrived at these ideas out of a moment of desperation and misunderstanding, greater access to legal resources, to legal aid, which is severely underfunded in Australia, of course, which has many consequences, could be one way of addressing it, making sure people do have the right advice and good access to legal help when they need it is another thing worth putting on the table.
Yeah, I don't want to give away the last chapter for the book, which I think is just excellent. But one of the things that you discuss in that is what kinds of options there are, and maybe some things that help Australia maintain some equilibrium. For example, you say not having direct elections for a prime minister or a president might help Australia avoid some of the extremes.
Well, it's an interesting point. I think Cam thought about that and wrote that bit because although QAnon, like some elements of QAnon did come to Australia and there was this Save the Children thing and all that, it never became like, it remained sort of with Donald Trump. Scott Morrison, who was the prime minister at the time, didn't become our hero, our QAnon, Australia's QAnon hero. And it was interesting, like looking at the history of conspiracy theories in Australia, and very few of them centered around any individual as like the hero. And maybe that's like Australia's, cultural aversion to putting people on a pedestal. That it's interesting. Like, yeah, no one became the kind of savior figure um, in many of the ones we looked at. And so we were thinking like perhaps the party system, the reason we don't sort of directly elect our supreme leader, like they elect the president of the United States, we don't really think of our leaders in that way. So that might have some sort of protective factor. It's just an idea, but it's an interesting one to toss over.
Mm. Leon Zambikis asks, do federal and state electoral commissions need more money and powers to counter election conspiracies and lies during elections?
Well, I'm sure they would say they do. They probably do. It's really interesting, like during both the 2022 federal election and the Voice to Parliament referendum, I reported on both of them, looking at some of the sort of hidden campaigns around them, some of the conspiratorial language and groups sort of organizing around them. With the 2022 election, it was a kind of interesting one because it was the first election after lockdown, after pandemic, after lockdowns, and there was an open question about whether some of these groups could become a political force. It didn't really turn out to be the case. It has actually turned out to be more the case at the local council level, where these groups have been able to more successfully organize and get people elected into local government. Um, but we did report on there was harassment of electoral officials. There was attempts from the AEC in particular to like push back against some of those claims. Like they would do a lot of it directly on social media, and tweet back or comment and I also through FOI got back then a lot of the conversations AEC was having with social media companies about what they were seeing on the platforms and asking for help with like removing some of the most extreme content that was harassing, was sometimes threatening, harassing AEC officials, or was directly calling into question the integrity of the election and things like that. So, yeah.
Mm. ACT and South Australia have truth in political advertising legislation. Maybe it's time for an equivalent around the country.
Yeah, I don't know. I have questions about how that operates, but maybe that's a topic for another day.
Okay. John Smith asks, how do we deal with conspiracy theories when they're espoused by people in power, such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr.?
Well, I guess we're going to find out in the United States. Seem It's a real tough one. I do think it's worth calling out. People should be comfortable with pointing out when people are using conspiratorial tropes, when they are relying on these like demonized sort of conspiratorial us and them narratives. I think it is a really dangerous tenor for our public conversations to take. So there should be a greater confrontation of it, where possible, but recognizing that it's difficult in this in the sort of a media landscape we have here.
Mm. Just sticking with the States for another question, Patrick Mahoney asks, maybe when government is taken over by conspiracy theorists, the true believers will turn on the government because they're now the elite. So the Epstein case is the example there.
Yeah, very interesting thing happening in the United States at the moment with this whole Epstein issue. An example of elites, an elite abuse of children, not that is not the conspiracy, but the conspiracy theories. There's plenty of conspiracy theories around that. And it has been extremely interesting to see how the MAGA movement, for want of a better way to put it, is sort of attempting to digest the failure of the Trump administration to like fully release the docs, quote unquote, and deal with this sort of strange conversations that government is having with Ghislaine Maxwell. This is all the exact stuff that if it was a democratic government would be like folded into some of these, some of these conspiratorial influences on their YouTube channels or whatever. The broadcast would be broadcasting about it night and day. But you can see the reluctance in some corners to be talking about it quite so directly. Now we're going to see what happens when conspiracy theorists are in power.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. This comes from David Cheney, who asks, Peter Grester, an Aussie journalist jailed in Egypt, says the three pillars of Australian democracy are the AEC, mandatory voting, and preferential voting. Could certain conspiracies be weaponized to try to dissolve any or all of these pillars? And also, if Russia meddled in America's elections, what vested interests might be interested in meddling with Australia?
Well, I'm certain, like, as I was saying, like during the recent elections, there have been narratives against, trying to undermine trust in the integrity of the Australian electoral process, whether, there's all this chat about like, don't use pencil because they'll rub it out and put like they'll change your vote, or there were attempts to do those kind of stolen ballot narratives in Australia as well, kind of borrowing from some of that American 2016 and 2020 election stuff. Yeah, I mean, I do think our election system is something to be closely guarded, and so the risk would be if parts of politics or parts of our political parties started to dabble in some of these concepts themselves out of, desire for some political constituency. Because it was interesting to see during the pandemic some politicians kind of footsie with with some of these movements. I guess out of can't put myself in their mind, but again, as I was saying, there was a debate about whether it would grow into a political constituency that would have effect at the federal level, and so far not quite. But you never know.
Well, I recommend this book really highly, Conspiracy Nation, especially for people who are trying to understand recent discussions in the news about sovereign citizens and where Australia is right now. So thank you so much, Ariel, for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you, everyone, for coming along and for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. We just didn't have enough time. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute's podcast, Follow the Money, After America, and Dollars and Cents. And we'll see you for Biggest Book Club next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.